1991 began a world of uncertainty and change. As the year began, the alliance of Western and Arab nations continued its buildup of forces in the Gulf. War with Iraq over its invasion of Kuwait certainly seemed a strong possibility, but was by no means a certainty. President Saddam Hussein made much of appearing resolute in the face of the huge military force being assembled against his own troops and the United Nations ultimatum.
In the next few days, Iraq arrives at a deadline that spells the limit of the civilized world's patience. Let me be clear about the upcoming deadline. January 15th is not a date certain for the onset of armed conflict. It is a deadline for Saddam Hussein to choose peace over war.
Hope was placed in last-minute talks in Geneva between Iraq and the United States, but a strained handshake was the closest they came to rapprochement. For Israelis, the threat of war was an immediate one, but perhaps the greatest fear was that of a gas or chemical attack, weapons Saddam had used in other conflicts. Israelis prepared themselves for the possibility of spending long periods in isolation. Iraq wasn't without its supporters, though. Basically, those who saw it as a champion of the Arab cause standing up against Western aggression. Jordan, a neighbor to and heavily reliant upon the powerful Iraq, saw itself allied to Saddam along with the Palestinians. With no compromise reached, the January deadline passed.
5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined. Our goal is not the conquest of Iraq. It is the liberation of Kuwait. These are the times that try men's souls. Those well-known words are so very true today.
Thomas Paine's words were equally apt early in the year in the Baltic state of Lithuania. As Lithuania government strove to get its independence from the Soviet Union, Moscow sent in troops to restore what it called a threat to central authority. When he appeared before Parliament, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev said that no one had wanted bloodshed and that he'd been asleep when a local military commander ordered troops to move in. Opposition members expressed skepticism, and on the streets of the Soviet capital, there were growing signs that Gorbachev's problems lay not only in the fringes. In South Africa, a nation well used to intercommunal violence, concerted efforts were being made towards reconciliation. For Hannah Tabando, president of the African National Congress, beginning of 1991 marked the end of 30 years in exile. At the time, President F.W. de Klerk was attacking the ANC for what he called fanning the flames of confrontation. But indeed, a historic meeting took place at the beginning of the year when Nelson Mandela, then the ANC deputy president, and Chief Buthelezi, leader of the rival Inkatha movement, met to hold talks. In a joint strategy for peace, the two organizations called on their members to halt all attacks on each other. However, despite initial hopes, the agreement was to prove most ineffective. Winnie Mandela was also in the news. She and 3 others faced charges in the abduction and assault of 4 youths, resulting in the death of one of them. In Ethiopia, the start of a new year brought no new beginnings. Continuing drought and civil war were producing an ever more powerful vortex into which the civilian population was being thrown. International relief agencies voiced their concern at the dreadful plight faced by millions of people. A war was also being fought in Peru, this time against disease. Concern turned to alarm when it was clear that a cholera outbreak was reaching epidemic proportions. Soon there were reports of cases in a number of Latin American nations. As well as fighting the poor water supply and sanitation conditions, the health authorities also faced an equally difficult time with the rapid spread of media misinformation about the disease. At first glance, the information being spread here was that Nicaragua had money to burn. And in fact, that's exactly what President Chamorro did before presenting the new gold Cordoba. In Guatemala, voters elected a new president, Jorge Serrano Elans. Jean-Antoine Aristide was sworn in as Haiti's president after free elections, a position he would lose in an army coup in October. And free elections in Bangladesh ushered in a new government. While Prime Minister Chungasheka's resignation in India would prove to be portentous. At the end of March, Albania held its first free elections. The ruling communists faced a challenge from 4 other parties. The poll was to be held in 2 stages, but at the end of the first round, the communists had won 160 of the available seats outright. Although President Reniz Anir failed to win his Dimana constituency, opposition leader Sani Barisha conceded defeat. Apparently it wasn't so much politics as economics that prompted close to 20,000 Albanians to flee to Italy. Rome came in for strong criticism for refusing some refugees permission to land. Eventually, some returned to Albania voluntarily, while others were relocated in camps around Italy. The beginning of the year saw the sowing of the seeds of another conflict that, unlike many others, would flourish and choke off life as it grew. Changing political landscapes have unearthed old nationalist desires. In Yugoslavia, first Slovenia and then Croatia sought to gain their independence. But few in the outside world were paying much attention. Most had been and would continue to be too preoccupied with another conflict. When more than words finally began to be exchanged in the Gulf, there was an ironic sense of relief for many of the Alliance troops there. The waiting was over. The fighting had begun. In the first days and the following weeks, the Alliance launched a series of air attacks inside Iraq and occupied Kuwait. Although some were in civilian areas, the Alliance said its bombing was selective and specific. The initial excitement of pilots saying they were receiving little or no opposition in the skies was tempered as the first report of aircraft losses came in. The realities of war were beginning to be felt. Despite the sophistication of their technology, the media of necessity had to rely on the military authorities for any coverage of the attacks that were taking place. Much was being made of the Scud missiles being held by Iraq, able to be moved around to different launch sites. They proved difficult to track down and a serious threat, especially to Israel. There were fears that the Jewish state would respond to any Iraqi attack by joining the conflict, thus threatening the Arab-Western alliance. However, with the supply of U.S.-made Patriot missiles and some diplomatic pressure, Israel was persuaded not to respond when the attacks eventually came. Saudi Arabia came under Scud attack too. And it was clear, even with Patriot protection, a disabled Scud was not a safe one.
Got a live hit on the air. Great, guys.
Some did die in these attacks and damage was caused as this one on Saudi Arabia. But ironically, it was to be in the last days of the war that a Scud claimed the lives of 28 American Marines. While appearing to stand little chance in the military conflict, Iraq was to take the initiative in the propaganda war. When United States aircraft attacked Baghdad in February, they bombed what they said was a military command bunker. The Baghdad authorities said the building was an air raid shelter. More than 200 people died and many more were injured. This created strains within the coalition. The first real ground exchanges in the war came in the battle for the Saudi border town of Hachi. Iraqi troops moved into the town and held it for a day before the alliance regained control after fierce fighting. It appeared Saddam's aim had been to provoke a full-scale coalition response, but the real land battle was yet to come. A huge oil slick appeared in the Gulf. Washington said that the Iraqis were deliberately pumping oil into the water. Baghdad said, however, that it is coming from oil pumping stations and tankers damaged in the airstrikes. Tension was rising perceptibly in the Gulf until on February 24th, the long-awaited coalition ground offensive began. The fight would be short, but horrific. Alliance casualties would be low, but the exact number of Iraqis and Kuwaitis killed during Iraq's occupation would never be known. After the year moved into its second quarter, events were progressing rapidly in Ethiopia. Israel airlifted 14,000 Ethiopian Jews from Addis Ababa to Tel Aviv after the military situation in Ethiopia deteriorated. In all, it took 41 military and civilian flights to get all the people out. In a television interview, the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir, said that United States assistance in the last stages of the operation had been vital. As the evacuees settled into their temporary new situation, events took a dramatic turn in their native land. The president had fled the country and anti-government troops moved into Addis Ababa. The process began in London to find out which of the rebel forces would be taking power from the defeated government and lead any transitional administration. Western officials warned that any future humanitarian aid to Ethiopia would be conditional on respect for human rights. When it seemed the civil war was finally over, an explosion at an arms dump in the capital brought death and confusion. Claims and counterclaims were made about who was responsible. While one force in the spiraling vortex was gone, the other remained: famine. And to add to the problem, there were now thousands of former government troops facing starvation after their defeat by the three main groups of rebel forces. Another group of Africans who were fleeing conflict in their homeland were Mozambicans, who crossed into neighboring Malawi. By May, the refugees amounted to 10% of the total population of their adopted home. But with Malawi unable to support them independently and with relief agencies straining to provide the basics, the prospects were very grim. Although hard to tell from her reaction, Winnie Mandela was found guilty of conspiracy to kidnap and accessory to the fact after assault.
Of assaulting anyone. And the judgment of the court has confirmed that position. The judge found her guilty of not reporting the assault committed by others. I believe that she did not know about such assaults.
Despite the agreement between the ANC and Inkatha early in 1991, the township clashes continued. The police were accused of giving open support to the Inkatha, a view the ANC said was given credence when a white policeman appeared to sanction the violence. Dismissed by some police as simply a joke, albeit in bad taste, the recorded statement helped to fuel the flames about a so-called third force operating in the township violence. Basically, they were whites who saw it in their interest to foment trouble within the black community. It was in this first half of the year that President de Klerk said that his government's constitutional reforms were still on their planned course.
ignition start. 3 good engines up and burning. 2, 1, 0, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Atlantis. And
the United States has worked hard to eliminate the tragic memory of the Challenger shuttle disaster in 1986. This year, another ghost was exorcised when Americans aboard the shuttle Atlantis made their first spacewalk in 5 years. And Soviet cosmonauts met in their space station to carry out some work. One of the few earthly phenomena said to be seen from space were the Gulf oil fires. The black, acrid smoke coiling up to the sky formed a thick blanket which cut out the warmth and light of the sun. Scientists warned that the effects would be long-lasting and predicted that it would take a few years to extinguish all the flames. Predictions that Saddam Hussein would be overthrown after his failed incursion into Kuwait came to nothing. His grip, however, proved stronger than some might have thought of or hoped in the former alliance nations. International agreement had not been reached on whether to allow Iraq to sell oil for generating income to repair war damage. There were fears, too, that ordinary Iraqis were suffering from the isolation created by their leader. Food was in short supply, and disrupted water supplies made disease an ever-present danger. When the Iraqi revolt against Saddam finally failed in April, a huge exodus of refugees began. By far and away, the largest group was the Kurds. An estimated 2 million sought sanctuary in neighboring Turkey and Iran, a journey that took many days and also many lives. Faced with an enormous task, Turkey initially resisted any attempt to give the Kurds a permanent home on its territory. And while Western governments continued to say it was an internal problem for Baghdad, the Kurds kept heading for Turkey. Eventually, the massive scale of the deprivation prompted a concerted international effort. In the freezing mountainous conditions, warm clothing and footwear were vitally important, but access was difficult. With a dreadful irony, some of the first supplies parachuted fell among the refugees, claiming lives that they were meant to save. Despite Baghdad's opposition, so-called safe havens were established inside Iraq to provide a temporary staging place for the Kurds in starting their new lives. Their obvious euphoria in the first half of this year had faded as the months passed. United Nations troops moved in to replace Western forces, which had established the camps initially. Nature's elements were taking their toll in many parts of the world. A tornado in Kansas. A cyclone in Bangladesh claimed 139,000 lives. Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines, spreading a blanket of ash that would eventually force the closing of a U.S. airbase. The crash of a Lauda airjet in Thailand led to the speculation that it was struck by lightning or sabotaged. It was later determined that the cause was mechanical failure. At least 80 died when an earthquake hit the Panama-Costa Rica border region, and 100 died in a quake in the Soviet Republic of Georgia. Political pressures were also building up in the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin, campaigning for the Russian presidency, was widening his power base. The former supporter of Mikhail Gorbachev was openly challenging the Soviet president, notably over the Union referendum. Gorbachev won the vote, but with 6 republics boycotting the victory was Pyrrhic. The death of a South Korean student beaten by riot police with steel pipes proved to be the catalyst for a series of anti-government demonstrations in the Southeast Asian nation. The protests were particularly violent and the most serious since President Wu came to power 3 years earlier. After a cabinet reshuffle, Wu promised a series of reforms. Violence marked campaigning for India's general election held in May. In the weeks leading to the first round of voting, hundreds of people died. The authorities seemed unable to contain the bloodshed. The outgoing Prime Minister, Chung Rashaka, held office only briefly. Hindu fundamentalists appeared set to fare well in the polls, but it was the Congress I party and its leader, Rajiv Gandhi, who appeared calmly confident. Yet one day after voting, India's political life was to be plunged into chaos. Gandhi's assassination while on his way to speak at a rally had a stunning effect on the whole nation, and a sorrow turned to anger over fears that the world's largest democracy would start to come apart at the seams. Congress asked his widow Sonia to pick up the mantle and lead the party into the second round of voting. That was a role, though, that had already claimed mother and son, Indira and Rajiv, and one that held no attraction for her. For the time being, at least, the name of Gandhi, control of domestic politics, was being confined to the flames by Rajiv's son Rao. There would be no phoenix rising up. Instead, his son Rao would fill Rajiv's position, if not his political shoes, and take the party into electoral success and leadership of the country. It seems a lightweight politician was now faced with the monumental task of rousing the nation from its profound pessimism. The abduction of a French aid worker looked as though it might delay events, yet he too was released within days. And then the word began to spread that yet another Beirut hostage was to be freed. When the American Edward Cressy was given his freedom in the middle of August, it seemed that the Gordian knot was beginning to be untied. Israel was brought into the equation with the return of the remains of one of its soldiers missing in action in Lebanon. For its part, Israel agreed to the release of a number of Lebanese it was holding. But although the process was progressing, it was a painfully slow one. The Israelis were still holding an Islamic cleric, Sheikh Obeid, and a number of Lebanese, while in Lebanon, Western hostages were still captive and the fate of Israeli troops a guarded secret. Elsewhere in the Middle East, tensions had been on the rise again. The United States began to build up its military presence in the Gulf. It said Iraq was failing to fulfill its obligations to the United Nations resolutions. Of particular concern was Baghdad's unwillingness to hand over information about its nuclear capabilities. This particular issue came to a head over the holding in a garage of a team of United Nations nuclear inspectors. The group was held for 4 days, but eventually they were allowed to go free, taking with them the documents relating to Iraq's nuclear programs. Discussions had managed to avoid a more open conflict. A series of talks in Thailand brought Cambodia's warring factions closer to a peace settlement. Some sizable differences remained, but it was agreed another round of discussions should be held. All of the 4 groups were under strong pressure to reach an agreement. Political isolation of a sort was also coming to an end for China. Britain's Prime Minister John Major was the most senior Western official to visit Beijing since the suppression of the Tiananmen Square uprising. Gorbachev was to play host to his American counterpart for discussions on strategic arms limitations. The Soviet Union also had a new president, although of only part of the nation. Boris Yeltsin became president of the Russian Republic. the power base had a much firmer foundation.
Да и добросовестно исполнять возложенные на меня народом обязанности.
In ancient times, a total eclipse of the sun was considered a momentous occasion. The attention it attracts among the general public now has more to do with its rarity value than any feeling of impending disaster. An oil tanker that exploded and broke up off the coast of Australia's coastline, causing a huge oil slick. And the sinking of a Greek liner off South Africa. Controversy surrounded that disaster after the ship's captain was seen to leave the vessel before most of the passengers. He felt his duty ended with his order to abandon ship. South Africa was finding itself brought in from international isolation as the year moved on. For the first time in the country's history, white and black cricketers have a common cause for celebration, a return to international competition. And South Africa's athletes were asked to field a team for the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona. There was wide support within the country for the sporting moves, but less so for a decision by the United States and a number of other nations to lift a series of economic sanctions. Americans stressed that it was only a partial easing, while the ANC felt the move a premature one. However, the disagreement about sanctions was soon overshadowed by another issue. It became clear that the Inkatha movement had been receiving government funding. Adrian Flock, the law and order minister, and the defense minister Mangus Milan were both implicated. Both were later relieved by President de Klerk. The scandal threatened to undermine constitutional talk that had been taking place between the ANC and the government. In August, de Klerk found himself under siege from the right wing of the white minority. Tear gas had to be used when the AWB extremists went on the rampage after failing to halt the president's speech. Blacks ran for their lives, and intercommunal violence continued in the townships. There was more than a hint of irony on the T-shirts worn by many of those involved. Yet, in spite of all this, South Africa's main political leaders met in September to sign a peace accord aimed at putting a stop to the nation's political violence. The agreement came at the end of the week that had claimed more than 120 lives in a bout of factional fighting that had swept through Johannesburg. And even though the task was enormous, the fact that 3 such men could have signed any accord would have seemed unlikely a year earlier. The summer had been a long and difficult one for Mikhail Gorbachev. If any records were to be set by him, it would be perhaps for walking the political tightrope. When he left for London and the G7 summit, he had no idea that the smiles he was leaving behind were anything but sincerely returned. But his government ministers were already planning a more permanent farewell. Tanks were soon on the streets of Moscow. The men Gorbachev had appointed to form his government had been wishing him well a few weeks earlier, and were now wishing him well out of politics. It was a very nervous-appearing Deputy President Yanayev who maintained the public farce over his leader's supposed illness. Yet the resolve was already cracking, and in 72 hours it would be all over. The plotters arrested, or in 2 cases, dead by their own hand. A failure to accelerate the very counter-revolution that it had sought to prevent. The coup over now put the Russian and Soviet presidents on equal footing, or perhaps even Yeltsin seemed to have the greater power. Communism was going, the Union was going, the old order had gone, but the oxygen of excitement that had filled the air for the previous few days began to fade, and the hard work began to find what would fill the vacuum. The strains of the welcome would have been more consistent perhaps for a head of state, rather than the wife of a former leader. But Imelda Marcos has not only grown used to the attention, she likes it. And it was quite an emotional occasion for Mrs. Marcos, who had not set foot in her homeland since her husband Ferdinand had been forced into exile more than 5 years earlier. One of the first places to visit was the home of her mother-in-law, Mrs. Marcos Sr., who actually died 2 years ago. She is kept in a refrigerated container. Condensation mists up the viewing window in steamier weather. The Marcos family say they'll not bury her until the body of her son Ferdinand, who also died 2 years ago and is lying also preserved in Hawaii, is allowed back to the Philippines to be buried by her side. Imelda's return visit was not simply to see friends and pay her respects. There are a number of outstanding charges against her relating to tax evasion during Ferdinand Marcos' 20-year rule. Her lawyer presented her bail wrapped in a Mr. Donut paper bag. The Philippine government wants to question the Marcos family about a number of things, including hundreds of millions of dollars worth of money that went missing from the exchequer during Ferdinand's administration. After giving her fingerprints but declining the offered handkerchief to wipe her hands, Mrs. Marcos was back off into the crowds. She has modestly described herself as the savior of the nation. She said that God would decide whether she is to run in next year's presidential elections. In Cambodia, with agreement reached on a peace settlement, Prince Sihanouk returned to his former palace. He was to receive a nice, warm welcome. Changes were also in store in Zambia, where voters went to the polls in presidential elections. The first multi-party voting in almost 3 decades. Seen as one of Africa's most enduring statesmen, Kenneth Kaunda had ruled unchallenged for 27 years. But it was to be a former trade union leader, Frederick Chiruba, who was to be sworn in as the new president after a landslide victory. Voters were attracted to his promise of economic and political reforms. Another dramatic development came late in 1991 with the opening of a Middle East peace conference in Madrid. All of the main groups involved in the conflict were represented at the talks. Despite some rancorous public exchanges, the general feeling was that some progress had been made and that a process had been started. The obstacles remaining were fairly daunting, yet once again, groups were sitting down to talk. Unfortunately, intransigence is a word that describes another conflict that escalated as the year progressed. Yugoslavia is a federation of 6 republics and 2 provinces forced out of the last World War. Macedonia, Kosovo, Serbia, whose population forms the largest ethnic group within the nation, Montenegro, Rachadina, Karasa, which sided with Hitler during the war, leading to a lot of the present enmities. Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Slovenia, the other state that has been seeking its independence. As the months went on, each of the groups involved in the conflict became more entrenched in its position and less trustful of the other side. The fighting devastated huge areas of Croatia, scene of the most bitter engagements. Even internationally organized relief convoys came under attack frequently. A way had to be found to break the vicious cycle if all-out civil war was to be avoided. Lord Cannington was given the task of finding a compromise between Franjo Tuđman, the Croatian leader, and his Serbian counterpart, Slobodan Milosevic. On the side of the Serbians has been the Federal Army. Despite numerous ceasefires being arranged, the end result was always the same. The Croatian town of Bukova suffered constant bombardment for several weeks. When the fighting finally stopped, people who had been forced to live in appalling conditions, mostly underground, were able to gather what few belongings they had left and leave. That is, except men between the ages of 16 and 60. No building was left undamaged, and more than a few were no more than shells. It took the Federal Army's attack on the architecturally magnificent Crystal City of Dubrovnik to prompt a larger international response to what was really going on in Yugoslavia. There was a strange ambivalence in many nations, the feeling that others should not interfere in Yugoslavia's internal affairs. A group of ceasefire observers got caught up in the Dubrovnik siege. The Federal Navy was blockading the port and for a time refusing to allow any ships, even those with humanitarian aid, to land at the Croatian city. For a time, it seemed, the world would witness another total destruction. Eventually, a ferry was allowed into the port. While Croatia and Slovenia sought their independence, Serbia fought on to impose a continued federation, and so the misery of its people continued. In the Philippines, Tropical Storm Thelma was ripping the nation apart. An estimated 6,000 people died when the violent winds swept through the islands. While what had been the Soviet Union was still feeling the effects of its political storm, cameras were allowed into Lenin's mausoleum for the first time. The final mystique has been removed. Revolution was an appropriate word as Leningrad turned full cycle and renamed itself St. Petersburg. The Baltic states had gained their independence and other republics were seeking to follow suit. The Communist Party was no more. Central control for certain things still rested with the Kremlin, but many of its powers were being evolved. What was not so clear was whether the people of the former Soviet Union were opening a cask of jewels or a Pandora's box.